Hello everyone. On behalf of the Palestinian Forum in Britain, I would like to welcome every one of you for taking part in the monthly conducted think tank meeting number 16. This session is dedicated to discuss a very significant topic regarding the Hamas new charter. The Hamas new charter and the Western response, and what kind of political effect might follow. This charter is of high significance, not only because the pragmatic attitude Hamas formally embraced, but also because it stripped the Zionists of all their tools which they have been using for nearly 30 years against the movement. It is argued that anti-Hamas lobbies are no longer capable of accusing Hamas as anti-Semitic, that wants to kill Jews for being only Jewish. It is argued that they are no longer capable of describing it as a dogmatic and a close-minded movement that does not understand but the language of blood. It is argued that anti-Hamas Zionist politicians maybe will not be able, after the newly adopted document of principles, to stigmatize it as a movement which is driven by fanatic ideology, as has been the case since it started. But at the same time, Hamas will not be left to achieve political or diplomatic breakthroughs. The political war against it would continue even if it totally succumbed to the international quartet's conditions. The Israeli lobby hasn't left even the Palestinian Authority embassies around the world without putting obstacles in front of them all time. So they will not spare Hamas despite all seemingly adopted soft line or moderation. What significance the newly adopted charter hold? To whom Hamas wanted to send this message of alteration and moderation? What kind of Western response on Hamas' newly document has been noticed, and what opportunities this step has opened for the future? These questions and other ones will be discussed with our respected speakers, Dr. Azzam Tamimi, expert in Hamas movement and political analyst, David Hurst, editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye, and Dr. Dawood Abdullah, director of Middle East Monitor. Welcome all. Let us start with Dr. Azzam about the newly adopted charter. It is said that it is designed by Hamas to satisfy the West, no more, no less. Is it a new charter, really? Or maybe it's a seemingly new looking charter? How do you perceive the situation?
Well, thank you. If the intention was to please the West, I'm sure this has failed, because it doesn't. As far as the main position of the movement is concerned, nothing really has changed. What has changed is the way the movement presents itself and presents its understanding of the conflict. There was always a problem with the old charter. The old charter was published and circulated in 1988, just a few months after the birth of the movement, in December 1987. And from day number one, it was realized that there was a major problem with that charter. I mean, insiders will tell you that it was written by one person. There was no real consultation. the circumstances the movement was in were not that comfortable, because the movement was under immense pressure from the Israelis, and many of its leaders had been detained and incarcerated. The old charter conceived of the conflict as a religious conflict, which is a non-starter. Yeah. It gave the impression that the conflict was with the Jews, and that this conflict with the Jews was perpetual, was permanent, as if to say that it was eternal. The old charter relied on conspiracy theory. It also quoted a document which is well known to be false, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a false document that was used by anti-Semites in Europe in order to justify persecution of the Jews. So in many respects, the old charter was very bad for Hamas, and as you said in the introduction, it was used almost constantly by the Zionist lobby in the West in order to attack Hamas and undermine it and give it a bad name. Now, the idea of writing a new charter is an old one. It was conceived as early as 20 years ago, but whenever the movement wanted to work on it, circumstances seemed not to help. I remember, as one example, for instance, that in autumn 2005, a meeting was held in Beirut, attended by senior members of the movement and some intellectuals and experts, in order to discuss how to go about writing a new charter. Yeah. But then, in a couple of months, there were elections in Palestine, and Hamas won the election. And immediately after it won the election, Ehud Olmert, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, convinced the United States of America to adopt his 3 conditions, which became known as the Quartet conditions. And as a result, Hamas decided to put on hold its project of rewriting the charter, because it didn't want to be seen as succumbing to pressure at the time. Yeah. So writing a new charter, coming up with a new document, is a purely Hamas need. Okay. It's a Hamas requirement. Now, what the charter came out to look like, that is another topic altogether.
Okay, I'll build on this and direct a question to David. David, do you agree that maybe about the motivations, maybe standing behind adopting the new Hamas discourse, if you want to describe the motivations behind this charter, does this maybe reflect real convictions about all aspects of the conflict between Arabs and Israelis, rather than being maybe done under pressure? Because it is said that there has been many pressures put on Hamas for a long time, and maybe the visits of Blair to Doha and meeting Khalid Mash'al about this issue put some pressure on the leadership of Hamas. How do you perceive this issue?
Well, I think there's always been pressure on Hamas ever since the preemptive coup in 2007 and the split and the destruction of the unity government. So Hamas has always been in a position of trying to break out of a physical siege, but also break out of a sort of international siege, a narrative that said we'll talk to anyone but Hamas. Tony Blair was one of the architects of that. And it's interesting that Blair is continuing to talk to the leadership of Hamas, even though the initial initiative which he brought failed because it didn't have the backing either of Israel or of Egypt. Blair continues to work as a bag carrier. That's an interesting fact of its own. What are the incentives to produce this new document? Well, it undoubtedly gets across the message to the international community, at least, that Hamas is a modern organisation, it's a rational one, it changes its position, it can do so collectively, It's primarily a nationalist resistance organization as opposed to a religious resistance organization. It's rational. You can negotiate with it. I think there are weaknesses of Hamas's position, because if you compare this, for instance, to the position that Sinn Féin and the IRA adopted in the peace process that took over 20 years here, they didn't abandon their Republican ideals. But they were absolutely seminal in negotiating directly with unionists and unionist paramilitaries. And the result, and they power shared. When I was a correspondent in Belfast, it would have been inconceivable for either Gerry Adams or Martin McGuinness to think or even talk of participating in Stormont, which they would have called a partitionist assembly. Partition meaning the 6 counties. They actually did that. But Hamas is not doing that. Hamas is not saying it's going to negotiate with Israel. So there are many more subtle things, I think, going on in this charter. I mean, one of the first questions I was interested in learning when I was recently in Doha was you know, why are they talking about 1967 when everyone has abandoned that in practical terms? Why are they going to Hajj when everyone's coming back from it, basically? And the answers I got were actually quite interesting. I mean, that's one way of looking at, you know, why are you abandoning? I think, you know, 67 is in there basically as a sort of memento mori, as a remembrance of things past. It's there to jerk people's conscience back to what they thought they were talking about, even in this long peace process, knowing full well that no negotiations now are effectively going to start with the Green Line on its basis. This has already been sold out. It's been sold out a long time ago. Every single time Abbas comes back to the negotiating table, he comes back roughly at the position that he rejected with Olmert the last time. So the current situation now, we did a story about it. It was denied by the Palestinian leadership, but I think it's a genuine story, all right, with a very good source. Was that the offer that Abbas made to Trump, or the informal sort of mood music that went round, was 6.2% of Palestinian land minus Jerusalem, which is a bit of a breathtaking offer to start a negotiation with, if you believe it. They denied, as I say. But again, there's this process of constantly saying, okay, we're going around into another round of negotiations, and this time we're starting where we left off. Now, Hamas putting 67 as the borders, even though they probably don't believe in it themselves, or say that this is I think very few people in the Hamas leadership would actually say this is a real practicality. Are there? They put them in there just to remind people of just how far this has actually slipped.
Later, but it seems that you put the issue in the context of self-revising inside Hamas about how it designed the new one. Is it the case that you put the whole issue in self-revising, maybe? No,
it's not. I mean, there's a big international element to that, to this, and that is that again, this is something we can come back to. We're not about, I think, to enter another 20 years of peace process. I think that period has actually gone. We're into a very quick-fire, uncontrollable series of very volatile periods, which is quite different from the Arab Peace Initiative. There isn't going to be a great amount of shuttle diplomacy going on, and the position of the key Arab states now is quite different from what it was then, i.e. Saudi Arabia is not the Saudi Arabia that would, for instance, bring two sides together in the Mecca Agreement. That's past and that's gone. We're into an attempt to impose a solution or impose a new leadership, a post-Abbas leadership on the Palestinian people, which is gerrymandered and fixed by Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Jordan and Egypt. That's not the same thing as the Arab Peace Initiative. Okay, well, and Hamas, so for Hamas to come with this document is basically I think, the first step in trying to revive a real debate and a real Palestinian leadership, when all the architecture of Palestine, right, PLO, PNC, PA, is just dead wood. It's a hollowed out building.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Dawood would like to build on a quotation, maybe it is stolen from David. He wrote regarding the alterations of the Charter of Hamas, and he titled his article saying that, is Hamas going to Hajj when everyone is leaving? Do you believe that the Hamas step is really too late?
No, on the contrary, I think this is a natural consequence of development within the movement, its political thinking. In this instance, 1988, when at the height of the Intifada, the character of the movement was like a generation of stone throwers, and as we said, a lot of religious rhetoric. But 30 years on, this is a movement that has, broken out of its sort of Islamic or Islamist confines, representing a small section of Palestinian society, and one that aspires to become a major nationalist force. So it has to make some adjustments to assume that role of leadership. So what we have with respect to, let's say, the 1967 sort of borders and acceptance of a state there, this was not something unique or peculiar to Hamas per se, but this was out of a national consensus. We had the prisoners' document in 2006. It was agreed by all the major factions, including Hamas. So in order to become this a nationalist force, albeit with its Islamic identity, it had to play a more consensual role. It had to open up and accommodate the various strands of Palestinian political thinking. So my view is that it's not a reversal. What we see today is not a reversal, but rather the consequence of its growth. I mean, when the document was launched on the 1st of May, Khalid Michel said, quite significantly, he said that, we have grown, we have evolved militarily, as we all know, but we have also grown politically. We control land. Today we have territory, we have people under our control, and we have to engage in international relations with the wider world. And so the thinking and the policies and the principles of the movement must reflect this.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Azzam, to whom Hamas wanted specifically to send this message of alteration or moderation? And in this context, will this message be received and welcomed regionally or and internationally?
I think apart from some of the countries in the region, we haven't heard any official response from European countries or from even beyond Europe. I mean, in the region, the countries that sympathize with Hamas or support Hamas or have some dealings with Hamas welcomed the new document, Qatar, Turkey. But Iran condemned it, as an example, for instance. Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf countries are not on very good terms with Hamas. So I personally have not seen significant responses. But once again, I must stress that the idea of writing a new document or a new charter was not a response to some geopolitical requirement as much as a response to correcting something that was wrong, and there was pressure building within the movement asking the movement leadership to do something about the charter.
And I think that you campaigned a lot about this issue
Yes.
for a long time.
I have one whole chapter in my book, actually, criticizing the charter and even suggesting how a new charter should be written. But also, in addition to all of this, the Zionist lobby in the West benefited from the old charter. And people like us who sympathize with Hamas and with the Palestinian cause and living in the West sometimes find it very difficult to defend the movement's positions if they are expressed in terms of the old charter. I remember something that happened to me personally when I returned from Japan in 2006 after Hamas was elected. There was a workshop or a panel at SAWAS, and I was speaking about what Hamas believes, or Hamas respect for democracy, for this and for that, and then someone stood in the hall and said, "What would you say to this?" And he had the old charter in his hand. And it was a real problem, because the old charter is a very bad document.
Yes.
And I would have loved to see the new document disown the old document, but it has not. And this is one of the weaknesses of the new document. I mean, if I were Khalid Mish'al, or if I were someone with an authority in Hamas, I would have insisted that this new document should in unequivocal terms be presented as a replacement for the old charter.
So regionally and internationally, you mentioned, you noticed that maybe there is no big response from
in the media. Yes, there was. There were a few comments in the media.
I mean, politically speaking,
but not governments. Are you aware of government responses?
I heard from Mogherini, from the EU commissioner. She said that our position is still the same and will not change until Hamas succumb to the three-quarters conditions.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any public statements that were made. I am aware of private messages that were sent to the leadership of Hamas, which were approving from America and also from the Foreign Commonwealth Office, from the Foreign Office, but nothing public.
Yes.
So they definitely took notice of it. They didn't ignore it, but they didn't actually respond to it in any way. I mean, the only public response came from Netanyahu himself, who staged this sort of great... but that, in a sense, was a bit of a compliment, because it meant that Israel was saying, actually, we're threatened by these form of words, and his only response was, "You don't mean them." But he, this sort of, it's worth nothing, you put it in the bin or whatever. But he was actually, in so doing, acknowledging the argument that the solution has to be based on Jew and Arab living together, and without occupation.
Yeah.
So that to Netanyahu is quite a threatening message.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that he actually had to respond to it in terms, but he was the only one who did.
But from your position as a very active journalist, have you noticed maybe in terms of the journalism how it dealt with this action, and how they put it in terms of moderation and more maybe resilient?
Well, it was. I mean, the papers that are very pro-Israeli gave it quite a lot of coverage, and it was noticed. I'm talking about New York Times,
The Guardian as well.
The Guardian, Haaretz. It was certainly noticed, and quite a lot of attention was given to it. Also, the whole process of this document being leaked from everywhere. Yeah. That was quite interesting in itself, how the actual leaks were dealt with. So it definitely marked a point, and it put its messages across. But there's been no official reaction to it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Abdullah, in this term, how do you interpret the ignorance of those journalism or even politicians to this development inside the Palestinian issue or cause. Why this ignorance? Why this negligence about something significant happened? It is always stigmatized as very dogmatic terrorist organization, and it is now showing that it is something else. Why this ignorance?
I think what we should acknowledge here is that this is not a position that is targeted or geared towards Hamas per se. But the media generally has not been very favorable to the Palestinian cause, the mainstream media, let's say. And the examples of this are, let's say, like people like Jeremy Corbyn and that student who headed the NUS last year, Malia Bouattia, and David Ward from the Liberal Democratic. These people were supportive of Palestine, as a whole and its cause. Yes. But they were vilified in the media and hounded, for months. Malia, when she was voted out of the NUS, said that she had to be treated for stress. In the case of Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, there was this famous controversy where he made some statement about Hamas and Hezbollah being friends, and then he had to retract that statement. And newspapers like the Times of Israel said that he rescinded the statement that he was a friend of Hamas. So on the whole, it is very difficult to support Palestine in the current atmosphere. It's very difficult, let alone support Hamas. You see, so that's the general sort of position, and therefore you would find very few journalists. I mean, what happened in if David would permit me, I mean, there were some things happening within the Guardian, for example, in recent years. People could not get articles in on Palestine, let alone Hamas, and not to mention, of course, the Telegraph. They just wouldn't do it. Even the New Statesman, the so-called liberal media in the UK, they don't want to touch it. I give you an example. We wrote something in the Middle East Monitor for the New Statesman, and we mentioned the word ethnic cleansing, and they came back to us and said, take that term out, ethnic cleansing. And we took offense with it because, they frequently, the New Statesman, they used to publish Ilan Pape. Yes. He regularly publish Ilan. And I said to them, look, Ilan wrote a book under the title, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And you guys want to pull our article because we use that term. But that, you publish Ilan. At the end of the day, we just said, we don't want to publish with you anymore because you have a problem, a very sort of, what shall I say, a prejudicial approach to the whole thing. So my basic point here is that even the liberal media, not the Telegraph, not the Spectator, the New Statesman, the Guardian, they find it difficult to publish on Palestine, much more to publish on Hamas. I just wanted to say one final point on the responses. Yes, Netanyahu, and he tore up the thing. But I think the cue to all of this is Trump also, they take their cue from the Westerners. They take their cue from the Israeli position. So once Netanyahu dismissed it, you could not expect acceptance anywhere in the West, not even from Washington. So when Trump came to Riyadh, he would say that, well, Hamas and Daesh and Qaeda, they're all part of the same, which is patently false.
Hamas David has something to say about this issue?
Just talking about The Guardian. I'm actually do not speak for The Guardian. I left it 3-4 years ago. I'm not a member of The Guardian anymore. But I remember once attending an event in the Israeli embassy. This is when they were still speaking to me. I was the foreign leader writer then at the time. The ambassador came up to me and said, "You guys are doing a professional job destroying us. I know how you work. You put a story in page 2, you put another story in page 13 and another story in page 30, and it's all coordinated." And I said, "Mr. Ambassador, you're wrong. The Guardian doesn't work like that. It's not coordinated. This is nonsense. Everyone takes their own decisions." Then I asked him, as he was talking to me, who is Israel's 2 worst enemies? And I was expecting him to say Hamas and Hezbollah. And with an absolutely straight face, he said the BBC and the Guardian. And they've acted on it. They really have acted on it. I'm not going to say anything about the Guardian, but I know they have acted on it. And they have put people in place in senior editorial positions to safeguard that in both institutions. Yeah. It's terrible because, quite apart from anything, the liberal press should be liberal and should maintain its values and not be subject to the fiat of foreign governments. But as we saw with the latest Shai Massot episode, that is absolutely what happens politically. It also happens with journalists as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Dr. Azzam, one of the new alterations is the one that tackled the identity of the conflict. The identity of the conflict, whether it is the conflict with Judaism or Zionism or, as you mentioned previously, regardless its religious background. To what extent do you consider this as a significant issue to build maybe bridges with the West itself? Has Hamas, theoretically speaking, succeeded in providing something to build on as bridges maybe with the West? Or
I think that change was needed not because of the need for any bridges. Okay. It was needed for itself.
Okay.
Because the old charter was full of mistakes. They had to be corrected.
This we agreed about it. But what about the bridges themselves?
They may. If you tell the truth, it's always better.
Yes, yeah.
The old charter didn't tell the truth. Okay. The old charter thought this fight in Palestine, this struggle, was a continuation of a long conflict with the Jews that has been going on for 15 centuries, which is nonsense. It's not true at all.
Yeah, yeah.
So you had to tell the truth. The Palestinians have been the victims in this conflict. History is on their side, and if history is on your side, you need not resort to fabrications like the document known as the Elders of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You need not explain events in terms of conspiracy theory. It damages your cause. And I think this is the most significant development within Hamas, expressing themselves in terms of what the conflict is truly about. And as the new document says, our problem is not with the Jews. Our problem is with those who invaded us and displaced us. That's the issue in Palestine. Actually, if you go even deeper, even the religious rhetoric of the Zionists is fake, because the Zionist movement originally was a secular atheist movement. Yes. Nothing to do with the Torah, nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with the Bible. But then they felt for marketing purposes they needed to justify themselves in terms of religion.
Yes, but how does this pave the way in front of Hamas to build these, I call it bridges with the West? No, how does it maybe affect this building of bridges?
It is a good starting point, but it may not help at all.
At all.
Because it all depends on the balance of power. The balance of power today is not in the favor of the Palestinians. Yes. I mean, you saw Trump. Trump comes to Riyadh. All these lads from the Arab countries come and bow before him. Yes. They prostrate themselves in front of him. They kiss his feet before his hands. And in such a situation, what do you expect? Of course, the Palestinian issue will remain neglected, will not be paid attention to. And Hamas was called terrorists in an Arab capital in front of Arab leaders, and nobody spoke. And this shows you how skewed the balance of power is. But of course, you have to tell the truth and wait for things to change on the ground.
David agrees with you when he said in his article, which I mentioned just now, that the major achievement of this document is to redefine the enemy. In the original charter, it was Jews and Judaism, as you mentioned. In this document, Hamas' enemy is Zionist project of settlement and occupation. The two are very different. What can Hamas build on this fact?
Well, build. What do you mean by build? As Azam said,
how can it invest in this fact?
It can put forward, it can construct a narrative, it can construct a position, but it basically has to wait for events. Events now are absolutely not about a peace process. If anything, they're about a change of Palestinian leadership. Again, as we haven't really stressed enough, that the purpose of Hamas doing this, or the political purpose, the immediate political purpose of Hamas doing this, is to get closer to other Palestinian factions. There's a danger of doing that. There could be a rush to moderation. There could be to differentiate yourself from Hamas, being a Fatah leader who negotiates with Israel. You could get into a position, and I think Abbas is moving, alas, into this position of offering more and more and more. And that, of course, won't create peace. And it would just create more and more problems. Again, there's also a question of what is the difference now between Hamas and Fatah. There are, in fact, lots of differences. But one recognises Israel, one doesn't. One cooperates with the occupier, the other doesn't. There are actually many differences, but politically, we're talking about a situation where Hamas is trying to move into the PLO and has actually some very good working relationships with senior Fatah members. But the guy right at the top is shutting his door and saying, I'm going to do this negotiation almost by myself. So there are some knock-on effects of what's actually going on. Abbas is absolutely determined, I think, and he's personally determined to not have a reconciliation with Fatah. Yes. With Hamas. I think he's jealous of Hamas and its cohesion, the fact that it had, he feels threatened by it, and he also feels displaced by it. So when you say, how can Hamas build on this, I think a lot has to happen first before you even got to the stage of building. There's still quite a lot of destroying and destruction left in this process.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Alwood, in light of not mentioning, as Dr. Azam said, that the new document would cancel the older one, the question of replacement will continue to be opened. To be an entrance, maybe for questioning Hamas' position, which is whether the document could be considered a replacement or a complementary or conflictual or what. the dialectic relationship between the two documents will affect the impression maybe Hamas may be keen on giving out of the new one. Is it a replacement? Because many people argue about this issue and still questioning the issue, as Dr. Azam just now mentioned. He himself, until now, may be questioning the issue.
Well, I don't see it as a replacement.
Not a replacement? So what? If it is
the old document exists.
Okay.
This one, and the old document was titled Al-Mithaq Lil-Haraka, yani the charter. This is titled what?
Declaration of Principles.
Principles and Policies. So the way it was framed, it allows the other one to slip into let's say non-existence by itself, and allow for this new one to come to prominence, okay, without having to openly say, well, we renounce the old one. Fine. But my position on this is, look, public statements, charters, and the like, that is not what's going to change the dynamics on the ground and the nature of the relationship. In 1988, the PLO did precisely what Hamas is called upon to do. Did it change anything for them? Yani, Arafat had to go to the UNGA in 1988 in December. The Americans refused to give him a visa to go to New York. They had to move the General Assembly to Geneva.
You mean 74?
88.
88.
Arafat specifically said, he read out the terms dictated to him by the Americans. We recognize Israel. We recognize 242. We recognize 338. We renounce violence. And they still didn't give him the visa to go. So, yani, the writing of this document, ultimately, it's not the document that will change the nature of the relationship with the West. What will change is what happens on the ground in Gaza and in the West Bank. If they could stand firm in Gaza, if they could continue to provide services, if they could to develop, some kind of economic relationship with countries in the West or in Africa, and that is what is going to matter most of all. And mind you, historically, the ANC was on the American terror list for 50 years. Yes. 50 years.
Including Mandela.
Yeah, the ANC as a body, 50 years. Only in 2011 when Condoleezza, right, she said it was a shame, a disgrace, that we keep the ANC on the terrorists. So we just have to be patient. And as I just said, until the balance of power changes. The question of the PLO, which is recognized internationally, and is the umbrella body of the Palestinian people, and Hamas recognizes it. It recognizes the need for reform of the PLO. It would be very difficult, for them to accept Hamas into the PLO, because its entry may just would open the doors for greater international acceptance and recognition, because the international community recognizes the PLO. So how to keep Hamas out? How not to recognize Hamas? Keep them out of the PLO, because if you bring them in, by default you recognize them. So this is why it's not so much whether it qualifies to become a member of the PLO, but because there are dictates from above saying to Abbas, you can't bring them into the PLO. If you bring them into the PLO, we don't have a choice but to recognize them.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abdullah. Dr. Azam, about this, many people said that the problem hasn't ever been in the Charter of Hamas, or about the Charter of Hamas, as much as it has been in its weaponry and resistance. So it does not matter how Hamas introduces itself. To what extent do you agree about this issue?
Of course.
It's not a matter of charter, it is a matter of arms of Hamas.
Of course I disagree. Of course I disagree. I mean, we Palestinians, we were robbed of our homeland.
Yes.
And we have every right under whatever norm you can think of to struggle to take back our homeland. I mean, if they give it back to us peacefully, we would welcome that. That would be the best choice. But if you continue to bring Jewish immigrants from everywhere in the world to live in my mother's house and on my father's land, what do you expect me to do? This is what the Palestinians are thinking. I mean, Palestinians have been rotting in refugee camps for 60 years. More than 60 years. Yes. And until when? They're not giving them back their rights. So Hamas has every right, as a national liberation movement, to use force in order to force the occupiers to give back the land. But the interesting thing about Hamas is that it's willing to enter into negotiations. And how Khalid Mish'al himself was asked this question on the night of the inauguration, and he said, as a matter of principle, negotiating, there's nothing wrong with negotiating. It's a question of when do you negotiate. You don't negotiate when you are the underdog, when you are under the hammer, when you are the weaker party. Because when you are the weaker party, they just step on you and they extract more concessions out of you. But as I conclude in my book, I say if the Israelis tomorrow wake up from their slumber and say to us Palestinians, we are very sorry for what we did to you in 1948. We acknowledge that it was wrong for us to come and occupy you and drive you out of your homes. We are willing to acknowledge our guilt. Can we live together? We will say to them, of course we can live together. We can sort something out. But first, they have to acknowledge that the occupation of Palestine was wrong, the invasion of Palestine was wrong, the displacement of the Palestinians was wrong. And as in South Africa, they declared apartheid null and void, Zionism has to be declared null and void for us and them to think about the future. Okay,
thank you. David, do you think that this interprets in a way or another the ignorance of the West to the Charter itself? Because they are only looking at the doings on the ground. When they see Hamas maybe digging, as it said, digging tunnels and preparing themselves for the other maybe war. So the Charter itself doesn't mean anything for the international society. Is it something interpreted this fact? Or?
Well, we're all talking about the West as some sort of monolith. There are varying different interpretations of what's going on, and there are different countries that have been involved. The Swiss have been very involved in talking to all sides. Again, a lot of this is done under the table, and possibly we'll get to a point where it's done actually overtly over the table rather than under it. I think, you see, one of the things that we're not really talking about, which is really important, is that Hamas, for all its problems and the siege and Egypt, has kept itself as a cohesive organization. If you look at other organizations, how would you define Fatah? Someone said to me once, well, it's the number of salaries we pay out. It's not a really brilliant definition for a political party. Is Fatah a cohesive political organisation? And I would say it's much weaker than it was. It's got very, very strong and different factions that are fighting around it. And so we're concentrating on Fatah. We're not really concentrating on the actual environment, which is very volatile and I think very changeable. As far as the Western reaction to Hamas, I mean, the Israeli security services and contain probably who have been responsible for assassinating Hamas leaders probably have a more realistic view of Hamas than the Western press does. And by that, They say that Hamas is there, we have to negotiate with it. It is the one that's currently keeping the peace in and keeping order in Gaza. They say that, not me. But of course, that discourse is a million miles away from the discourse that you'd get in either New York or in Likud. So there is realism in some unusual places, and I think the document helps bolster that narrative, except that for the moment it is under the table. At some point it will become overt, and at that point I think Hamas is positioning itself for a seat at the table.
Okay. The last question to Dr. Abdullah, and I'll hear from both of you as well. In his comment, David mentioned that this redefinition of Hamas could open the path for talks and for peace. But it will need a clear vision for the way forward. What kind of vision that Hamas could provide for the international society to build peace or talks or whatsoever?
Well, I think the vision is outlined in the chart.
Is it clear and
it's clear.
Crystal clear.
Yani,
but David said now,
total liberation. There's no ifs and buts. Yani, it's total liberation. Acceptance of a state in the West Bank, but that does not mean surrender of Palestine in its entirety. That's the right of return. Yani, all of that is clear cut. But that's a political sort of framework. But it has to have, it must be accompanied by a lot of public relations in the West. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not just a question of political negotiations and positioning. What is required here is a great measure of public relations. And I tell you why. Because when we look at the West, the major countries, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, probably to some extent, and they are the ones who basically refuse to even recognize the state of Palestine. And I know, in the last 8 to 10 years, there have been talks at a high level, at least with the leadership of Hamas and former diplomats and people who have relationships with these governments, from America right through to London, Brussels, Berlin, etc. What we found was that Britain, as an example, was most obstructive. Either they don't attend these meetings, or when they come with a very negative sort of approach to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So those talks, and I expect them to continue in the future. But I think the opening here for Hamas is when you look at the EU as a body, 10 of the 28 members have recognized the state of Palestine. 10. And that 10, mainly from Eastern Europe. Poland, Slovakia, etc., Romania, and then Sweden. The change doesn't come. The change will not be delivered to Hamas in terms of relationships. It has to make the change. It has to try to force it somehow, by utilizing this opening with these states in Eastern Europe. That's on one level. Let's take the issue of the 1 minute. Let's take the issue of the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice said that Hamas should be removed from the terrorist list. Yes. Huh? Now, has the movement made capital out of this? Since the ruling, what is this has to be exploited, because there is a legal basis, for removal of Hamas from that list, which is the stigma,
has appealed,
which is the stigma. Then we come to the issue of the boycott and divestment, etc. Hamas has to position itself in these movements, and not just wait for the Whitehall or the White House or the Elysee, to make change. We have to work on the ground also.
Thank you, David. What did you mean about the vision? What did you mean when you said that? But it will need a clear vision for the way forward in your article.
Primarily, I meant...
What kind of vision?
Well, I meant... what I was talking about there was a clear path to a situation which in which it expressed the end point of the conflict, and that would be substantially more than Palestine in '67. And I think that will be a position that will evolve. I don't think the line on '67 is something. I think that could be superseded in the future. The thing that I would like just to add to what Dawood said very eloquently was that the West is a busted flush when it comes to the Middle East. It's morally exhausted. It is not the source of either mediation or negotiation. Trump is physically incapable, or indeed Tillerson, of shuttle diplomacy. He has a major legal process underway which could possibly end in impeachment. This is not the conditions for which America, being the superpower, the only remaining military power, world power, could impose a solution or peace. So what I mean by vision is that primarily what has to happen is there has to be a locally generated Palestinian leadership, of which Hamas could form a part. That process really has to happen one way or another, not another thug imposed, not another mukhabarat guy that's been tutored by MI6 and the Emiratis. It's got to be someone who actually has real standing and who is elected. And I think that really is the next step through all the chaos. Not a peace process, but a leadership process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Azam, what's the next step in the end?
Well, I still believe that the new document and the changes in it should not be thought of as a means to a PR project. It doesn't work this way. Even before the document was published, years before the document was published, there was a moment when President Mohammed Morsi was elected in Egypt, when the Israelis were dying to talk to Hamas because the balance of power changed. Yes. The Israelis were dying to open a back channel with Hamas, and they approached a number of European governments for this purpose. So you see, a slight change in the balance of power will make a big difference. So this document is about presenting yourself correctly, factually. But what happens in the field very much depends on the context, on the balance of power, regionally as well as internationally. And I think we will probably have to wait for a while for this to happen.
Thank you very much. By ending this session, would like to thank Dr. Azam and David Hurst and Dr. Dawood Abdullah for this significant contribution. And please join me to thank our speakers.